Peter Zeihan is a geopolitical strategist, futurist, New York Times best-selling author, and highly sought-after speaker. Utilizing his keen eye toward the future and unique strategic approach, Peter strives to decipher complicated topics and issues into insightful, relevant takeaways for diverse audiences worldwide. Founder of Zeihan on Geopolitics, Peter offers distinct insights and perspectives on global affairs through his books, newsletter, podcast series, and numerous appearances on prominent networks like Bloomberg, Fox News, CNN, and NPR. We're thrilled to have him join us again this year. Please welcome Peter Zeihan.
Don't be shy. Who has no idea who I am? Hands up? Okay. For you folks, no one ever brings me in because they want to feel comfortable. Everybody know this asshat, right? Okay. I would argue this is the most important person in human history, not because of where he was from or what he did, but because of who he scared. Americans. We were so terrified at the thought of facing down the Red Armies on the plains of Europe that we knew we needed allies, not to stand with us, to stand in front of us, to absorb ammo. We needed cannon fodder. And so at the end of World War II, we sent our Navy out to patrol the global oceans so that anyone could go anywhere at any time, interface with any market, access any commodity, if in exchange you would join our Cold War against the Soviet Union. And it worked, and it generated the greatest alliance in human history. And today we call that process globalization. But then the war ended, and the Soviet Union was gone. And in a series of ever more internally focused, narcissistic political contests in the United States, every single time Americans were given a choice, they went with the economic nationalist. And that includes the transition from Trump to Biden. Trump gets a lot of crap, accurately so, for tweeting out a new economic policy and then going to play golf. Joe Biden takes those same tweets, runs them through a grammar checker, and builds them into policy. From an economic point of view, international economic point of view, they're the two most similar leaders we've ever had. Now, there's a lot of places that we can take this. Strategy, agriculture, energy, manufacturing, whatever it happens to be. But for this crowd, I think it's best to understand how this process is now over. And for that, we have to start with the guns. What we've got here is a supercarrier, and this is a jump carrier. On the deep blue sea, in a fair fight, it takes 8 of these to take on 1 of these. There are 25 of these in the world. 10 are American. There are 12 of these in the world. All are American. In a fair fight, the world's navies versus the US Navy, it's about an 8-to-1 mismatch. Now, I know, people are talking about how the Chinese are building their Navy, but let me put that into perspective. They're doing sea trials for one of the big ones right now. It's not nuclear powered, it can't get up to speed, its range is only about 1,000 kilometers from any base. Not a real carrier. The Chinese won't claim that it is. They also have 2 of those. One used to be a casino. The other one is a clone of the one that used to be a casino. They're early in carrier aviation. Now, yes, this means that the United States has a bag of hammers it can drop on anyone, but that is not what you need to make global trade work. To make global trade work, you need to make the tens of thousands of vessels, civilian vessels, that are on the oceans at any time feel safe. 12 supercarriers is not going to do that. You need at least 800 of these. Frigates, destroyers, small ships that can be everywhere. We have 60, half of which at any given time are protecting the carriers. Our Navy retooled after the Cold War because we thought the future of conflict was Iraq or North Korea. Well, it's a different world. And the Americans do not have the force posture that is necessary to support globalization any longer. So that's piece one. Even if Americans wanted to keep this system going, we no longer have the capacity. So the question then is, what about the other side of the equation, the economic side? And for that, we need to look at demographics. This is a standard profile. You've got children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Mortality builds it into a pyramid. This is South Korea at the dawn of the globalized era. Now this is a very specific economic model. You have a lot of people under age 45, young parents starting lives, building homes, raising kids, lots and lots of consumption. But in that 45 to 65 block, there aren't a lot of folks. But that's where the capital comes from. Because once your kids have left home, you start saving for retirement. And specifically, the block of population from age 55 to 65, that's 70% of global private capital. So in this sort of system, high consumption, high growth, lots of economic activity, but not a lot of capital, not much of a tax base. Now, with Stalin and globalization, we changed the way we live, because here everyone's living on a farm, because kids are free labor. You have as many of them as you can put up with, plus one. That's how you find out it's too many. But with globalization, we all started getting access to manufacturing and services jobs, and every single one of those jobs is in cities. And when you move from the farm to the cities, kids are no longer free labor. They're a source of headaches. And adults aren't stupid, so we had fewer of them, and here are the Koreans now. Radically different model. The consumption's gone. Now, you've got workers with literally decades of experience, very productive. You have a lot of folks in that 55 to 65 block, lots of capital, big tax base. But it's more deflationary. The whole world has made this transition since 1945. Different starting points, different paces, but we're all on the same road. And in the next decade, the Koreans will lead us into something new, because that block of capital-rich, high-skill workers that they have will move into mass retirement. And they will have to figure out an economic model that is not based on consumption or on production or on investment. What will that look like? I don't know. This has never happened before in human history. We are literally making this up as we go. All right, let's look at the big four. In the United States, we have aged more slowly for a couple of reasons. Number one, globalization for us was a security plan. If we had invested our economy into the global commons, we would have just been another empire. So we did it more slowly. Also, the US has a lot of elbow room. So we didn't go from farm to city, we went from farm to small town to suburb to city. And that meant our birth rate still fell, but by a much slower rate. Our number one partner now is Mexico, which has the healthiest demography in the advanced industrial world. And then here is Europe. This is a problem, but not nearly as big of a problem as this is. If you want a Mercedes, buy it now. Get 10 years of parts. You're going to be needing those. And then there's China. This is already the 5th fastest aging workforce in the historical record, and this data is wrong. This is data from last June. In July, they updated the data. Check out this bottom pit. The Chinese officially are now reporting that in the last 6 years, they've had a greater decline in their birth rate than what was suffered by the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. And this is still wrong. The Shanghai Academy of Sciences estimates that this overcounts the population by over 100 million people, with this being the missing millions. This is now the mid-case scenario. Independent demographers, most of whom are now under house arrest, suggest that those yellow bars should actually encapsulate 250 million people. We have yet to, as a species, develop an economic theory that might function in what this will look like in just 10 years. We are in the final decade of the People's Republic of China, and by the end of this century, we will be experiencing a post-Han Asia. That changes a few things, but we're here to talk about Europe. Former Soviet world, it is on its side because you know I'm an author, so just tilt your head a little bit. I'm not going to judge out loud. Okay, the green part. If you're going to be in Russia, that's where you want to be. That's where the winter is not so horrible that you can't even grow wheat. If you go to the north, to the blue, you're in tundra and Tegai, and it is empty and it is worthless. Or you can go to the yellow in the south, and which is desert, which is equally empty and worthless. But what drives the Russians to binge drink is the beige in between. Territories that even by Russian standards are worthless, but they're flat and they're open, and you can totally shove a Mongol horde through there. So, the strategy for the Russians going back to the early czars has always been the same. Expand out of the green, through the beige, until you reach a series of geographic barriers that you can't run a panzer division through. And then forward position your troops in the access points between those barriers. If you can do that, you can preclude invasions from ever happening. And under Stalin, they pulled that off. And then it all fell apart at the end of the Cold War. And everything that the Kremlin has done since, not Putin, the Kremlin, has been about rebuilding that outer crustal defense. The Ukraine war was always going to happen. And it's not the first post-Soviet conflict. It is the 9th, and it won't be the last if the Russians win. Now, if you remember back to the opening week of the war, when we had that 60-kilometer-long convoy of military vehicles going from Belarus south to Kyiv, and people like me were like, wow, I thought this would be quick. I didn't think it would be that quick. And then the convoy stopped on the 4th day of the war because the Russians forgot fuel. I don't know anyone in any NATO capital who saw that as a positive development. Because if there's anything we understand about the Russians, this is how they see the world. And we now know that the Russians don't have an army. They have a mob with guns. Very different proposition. And so if the Russians succeed in Ukraine, when they come for the next line of countries, which involves Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and of course Poland, they will come against NATO, and they will be obliterated. But that doesn't change their security perceptions and needs. And they will use everything that they have. And we will find out just how good our missile defense is. That is the price of letting Ukraine fall. That's the why. Here's the why now. 15 years ago, the Russians just stopped collecting data and started making it up. So this bulge probably doesn't exist. There are 8 million men left in their 20s in the Russian Federation. Between defections, out at migration, and death, they've lost 1.5 million in the war so far. They can maintain this pace for another 6 to 8 years, and then Russia is over. The Russians are fighting for space. They're fighting for what they perceive as a defensible perimeter. We are fighting for time. All right, let's talk about Poland and the region. Agriculture. The deep green on this map are the parts of the world that were under large-scale cultivation before the Industrial Revolution. All the light green are the areas that have been brought under till since. So whenever you're thinking about agriculture, wherever you are, land quality, input access, those are the two things you have to look at. Now, in the case of Europe in general and Poland in specific, there's a lot of dark green. The land is good. Let's talk about the input question. The big numbers on the left, that is the percentage of each of the 3 major nutrients, nitrogen, phosphate, potash, that the Americans import. You'll notice that for the first two, we're pretty much self-sufficient. Potash is where we have that exposure. However, that big wedge, the big red wedge, all that exposure, that's Canada. So, they're good for something. These are the only parts where the Americans are vulnerable to conflict zones. A couple small wedges, very manageable. Here are America's primary agricultural competitors. Well, crap. Oh, it gets worse, because here's China and here's the Middle East. You break down globalization, the global food supply system breaks with it. Now, in the case of Europe, you are somewhere in between. Your exposure isn't to Russia, it's to the Middle East, which I know normally sounds bad, but if you look around the world right now, the Middle East is the calmest part of it, which feels very strange, but go with it while it lasts. Also, your overall exposure, while it's right at about 50%, is not nearly as big as all of the other major agricultural players because your land is better. So on ag, I am not worried about Europe. Let's talk manufacturing for a minute. If you're at the bottom of this matrix, your supply chain is so simple you can write it on the back of a cocktail napkin after you've been at the bar for a couple hours. If you're at the top, you have no idea who your fourth-tier supplier is, much less your 14th. If you're all the way on the left, your system is dependent upon mainland China, and if you're on the right, it's already within the EU network. Everybody got that? Okay. Couple stakes in the ground. Doesn't get much easier than this. Primarily agricultural inputs, agricultural labor comes from the locals. Most of the consumption and processing is here as well. This is as simple as it gets. And this is the opposite. The iPhone has 1,400 supply chain steps. And after 4 years of dogged efforts by Apple to diversify away from mainland China, they have gone from 91% exposure to 90% exposure. Whenever a new model comes out, I buy an extra because I will never use Android. Here's everybody all at once. The future of Europe, and specifically the future of Poland, is this oval. Things that are in that mid-sophistication tier, but not necessarily energy intensive. These are the productions that we're going to lose on a global basis as we lose China. And these are the ones that Poland, from a labor point of view, from a capital point of view, from an industrial plant point of view, is very well positioned to step into. I'm not too worried about energy in Europe because you've got Norway. I'm not too worried about agriculture in Europe because you have land quality and processing. I'm not too worried about manufacturing in Europe if you can figure out the consumption side of the equation. But from a production point of view, this is a growth story. And that means we have to look at one final piece, and that's the guns. The outgoing Polish government, PIS, had a lot of not fans, and they were never really accused of looking forward all that much. But they placed a lot of orders for military hardware from South Korea. And if everything that they ordered actually gets purchased and implemented and folded into the military capabilities here, it's not that Poland will have a more powerful land force than Britain or France or Italy or Germany. It will have a more powerful land force than Britain and France and Italy and Germany. The last time we were in a situation where Poland was on an industrial, agriculture, and strategic rise, and its neighbors were doing the opposite thing, Poland conquered Moscow. Now, I'm not saying that's where this goes. Don't overplay this. But we are at the beginning of a turning of the tides, a structural shift in the economies of the region and the military aspects of the region. The question is, what will Poland do with this opportunity? It's an interesting one. It's the same structure as Germany, but the bulge is 25 years younger. So if Poland does nothing different and just kind of lays back and rides the wave, you've got a generation-long golden age in front of you. The question is whether it's one generation or more. Now, if everyone in Poland who's aged 30 to 50 has 3 to 5 kids, this is a century transfer. You can do this once for 30 years, or you can do this forever. That's the choice in front of you. But if you want to do it forever, you kind of need to get to it.